Cool, we got a good crowd here. So, welcome. Thanks for coming out to PowerShell Summit. This is an awesome event, and I absolutely love coming out and getting to spend time with this community. And thank you guys for coming to take a listen to me talk some about desired state configuration. And so today we're going to start out talking about DSC resources. These are the things that really drive desired state configuration and are the real workhorses. And so I'm going to get to share with you a little bit about what a DSC resource is, some of my experiences with them. Why does that matter? Well, my name, for those of you who I haven't met yet, I'm Steve Morawski, and I'm one of the sysadmins at Stack Exchange. You may know one of our little Q&A sites, Stack Overflow. Otherwise, we also run 100 and some other Q&A websites covering topics from pets and parenting to Judaism and Christianity to systems administration and everything in between, patents, and you name it, we've got a Q&A site for it. So we're one of the few web startups out there that run on a good portion of the Windows stack. And in that environment, I've been using for the past just about a year now desired state configuration to drive the configuration across a number of our servers. And the coverage that I'm managing is growing more and more. And so I've gotten to kick the cut tires pretty well with desired state configuration. And so I want to share with you some of the stuff that I've learned the hard way, and some of the stuff that's I found quite delightful with desired state configuration. So we're going to start out with DSC resources. So really, DSC resources are the building blocks that we use to compose our infrastructure. They are the things that we can kind of glue together in a number of different ways, just like our Lincoln Logs or Tinker Toys, or if you prefer your Legos. We can compose these things to make our servers look like what we want them to do. And the resources are what actually do the work and to build that state. So the resources themselves should be a few particular things. We're going to drill down in just a minute into what a DSC resource actually looks like and how it plays in the DSC environment, how the agent invokes the DSC resources, and we'll kind of get down to the nitty gritty there. I know the kind of outline is I talk for half an hour and then you guys ask questions for 10, 15 minutes afterwards. Ask questions as we go through. If you have a question, raise your hand, shout it out, whatever. Because if you're thinking something's not clear, it might not make sense till the end, I'd rather address it right up front. So please ask questions as we go. And chances are, if you have a question on it, somebody else in the room probably does as well. All right. DSC resources. These things should be very discrete. So when we think about, say I need to configure Exchange Server, or I've been talking recently, a couple guys talking about FIM, want to get the identity manager going. Or in my case, I need to set up some websites. I could create a resource that's set up Stack Exchange, set up the Stack Exchange application that covers everything under the sun. But that's not really what I want to do. When we design a DSC resource, and I'm talking very specific, there's a couple of components in the DSC infrastructure, and I'm going to talk about the configuration document in the next session, and some of the tooling and pull server environment in the session after that. The DSC resource themselves, these are the very discrete building blocks, very much like what we'd consider a function or commandlet. Where it works on a very, very small unit. So I want my resources to be things like file, registry entry, some of the things that ship along firewall rule. I want execution policy, or I want to have a particular application install, web app pool, website, Active Directory, OU. I want my resources to be very discrete, very small, so they're reusable components that I can use then to build out what I want overall. When we talk about configurations in a little bit, we'll see how they all build together to make something impressive. But the resources themselves, we want them very focused, very narrow. We also want them flexible. We can take parameters on our resources. We want them to be able to be repurposed, so we don't have to write a special resource. So I don't need a special resource to install Mercurial, or I don't need a special resource to install .NET 4.5, or I don't need a special resource to install the web server role. I want to have resources that I can repurpose to do multiple things. And so my resources should be general enough that they can target multiple things. They also need to be resilient. And the reason for this is desired state configuration is different than your standard configuration scripts. So, or if you say you have a gold image of a machine that you deploy, and now I'm going to run some scripts against it to get it in the state that I want it to be in so that it's where my environment should be. I might have an orchestration engine running the script. I might run it. Fine, whatever. It runs once. And my system gets set up, or it doesn't, and I can take action at that time. Desired state configuration, on the other hand, this thing's running every 15 minutes, every half hour, however often you configure it. But this thing's running continually on your system. And it's watching for state to change and for things to deviate. And it needs to be able to handle somebody logging into that box and putting it in an inconsistent state, or a drive failing and a resource not being available, or the network's not available and it can't get to something to check in. And if your resources blow up on any of these little errors, now my system configuration is going to be in a very unknown state. I don't necessarily know where things stopped processing until I get to the event logs. So we need to be able to handle errors. And this stuff is going to be running unattended for the most part. You're not going to be watching this run on all of your servers every 15 minutes. So we need to have good logging. We need to handle errors. And especially when we're running in a pull server environment, we need to handle every type of error, non-terminating and terminating. Because in the context of DSC and a pull server, a non-terminating error is terminating. Yeah, that caught me by surprise at first. So we have to be extremely resilient in how we develop our resources. And that's where keeping them focused, or keeping them focused and discrete and small helps, because now we have less surface area really to write our error handling around. We also want our resources to be idempotent or deterministic. So no matter how many times this thing runs, it always gets us just to the state that we want it to be in. We want to be able to run this thing constantly through the day and not have it, if things are working, not have it break things. We want to be able to have the script execute constantly. And if things deviate, to bring them back. But otherwise, if things are going along just fine, things should not be interrupted. I was talking to John Walls about how he was trying to use DSC to do some installations, and one of the things was that he had a prerequisite that to do the software installation, it had to put the remote desktop server into an install mode, which would kill user sessions and let them install the application. Well, now you're going to need some custom resources, because you have to check before you want and go put server into install mode. You want to make sure that things are not where they need to be, because you don't want to, every 15 minutes, put this thing in install mode to go check things. So we need to be very cognizant of how our resources work on a remote machine, that they're not going to impact operations unless they need to. Now, the DSC, the local configuration manager, has some options. You don't have to have this thing auto-remediate your systems. You can't have it just log the differences. But the real power of desired state configuration comes into this kind of self-healing infrastructure, where if something does deviate, that it can bring it back. The other thing that we want to consider with the resources is that we're not just ensuring things are there. We can use these things to ensure things are not there and not present. So when we write our resources, when we develop these things, if we want to make sure that we provide an option so that if somebody does not want this feature enabled somewhere, that they have a path for that. Now, that doesn't make sense for every potential workload, but if there is an option to go one way or the, for example, the Windows feature resource, I can ensure that a feature is never installed or never stays installed on a particular machine. You know, little story, previous job, I had I had a web server. It was in our UAT environment, exposed to the internet. Customers logged into this thing. Developers had some access to it. We were troubleshooting a problem. I logged into the box, and there's the Active Directory tools installed on this publicly accessible web server. That was not a happy day for me. So now I can go in my desired state configuration. I can say, Active Directory RSAT tools, not installed, ensure absent. I don't want these things to be there. So we want to provide an option to provide positive and negative control of these situations. And finally, we really want these things to be chatty in the sense of logging, because we're not watching these things run interactively for the most part, and they're happening independently on multiple nodes. We want to be able to have good logging of what's happening and what's going on with these resources, not just resource started to run test, resource finished. So we want to make sure we litter our resources with a lot of write verbose or write debug, because the DSC engine will actually capture those write verbose and write debug messages and channel those into the appropriate event log for us. And that's all. They also can get channeled back to us when we run test DSC configuration or start DSC configuration. So verbose messaging is very, very helpful in the case of the DSC resources. All right, that's enough of this. So let's actually get down and take a look at DSC resources and the structure and how we can build these things. Okay. So yep. I knew I had to forget something. Let's grab a mouse so I can. I'll just use Control+. That'll work. All right. I'll set up for the next session. So DSC resources, at their very basic, we have three functions that we need to implement for a DSC resource. We need, is that big enough for everybody? Okay. We need get target resource, set target resource, and test target resource. So what's the point of these things? So what happens when we run desired state configuration is the DSC engine takes the MOF document that describes how our system will look, which lists out all the resources that are going to be called, and it'll run through, for its consistency check, it'll run through and call test target resource for each resource as it's going and processing them. And test target resource is going to return true or false. And either I'm in my desired state or I'm not. If I'm in my desired state, hey, everything's great, Bob's your uncle, keep moving right along. If we're not in our desired state, if it returns false for any reason, then we hop into this set target resource. And that's what does the work to get us into our desired state. Get target resource, we get to leverage later with get DSC resource, where it can return the current state of the system. So the main workhorses, though, are really your test target resource and set target resource. When we're building our DSC resource modules, these three functions, they don't have to be the only three functions in your resource, but these three functions need to be there, and they need to take the same parameter set. It might seem a little odd that you're passing, the same parameters from from set and test target resource to get target resource, but it keeps it in a nice clean interface. And one of the documents that we're going to look at, the schema.mof in a little bit, it actually describes what parameters get marshaled everywhere, and how the DSC engine actually gets parameters to our modules. So I've got my get, set, and test target resource. We've set some parameters up. Let's actually go and look at a real resource. So if you're looking for some examples of what these things look like, there's a GitHub repository under PowerShell.org that has a number of community modules. It has many of the resources the Microsoft PowerShell team has released that we've reprefixed per their guidelines, and we have those so we can take contributions and pull requests and things like that. But it's also something you can go and take a look. And most of the resources that I'm writing for work, I'm also publishing there, and contributions are welcome. Whether it's documentation, whether it's new resources, whether it's bug fixes, hey, the more the merrier.
Make it mandatory state. They don't get out unless they contribute.
Yeah, okay, that works for me. You guys are stuck with me until you contribute. How about that? I'll keep talking until I get a contribution. No, that's too mean. So our DSC resources, they're a module that expose these three functions. But we don't land these things on our PS module path. We actually store these resources in another module. So there's a module that hosts all of these things. One nice thing about that is it doesn't clutter up PS module path so much. So if we run get module, you're not going to see tons of resources coming back that you're not really going to be calling interactively. But we have a full, that's probably not so easy to see there. Let's go in here. All right. So I have a module that actually has nothing else in it but a PSD1 file. The PSD1 file for the module hosting your resources is important. I could have other functions in here. That would be fine. In this case, this only exists for me to distribute resources. But the PSD1 file is important because when we generate our configuration document, we'll look at this in greater detail in the next section, but that module version gets stamped in there. And the module version is very important then in a pull server environment, because that's how the pull server knows what module to send down to the clients and how the clients know what to ask for in that case. So the module version for the host module where your DSC resources live is extremely important. And if you're not seeing updates to your resources being distributed, it's a very good chance you didn't increase or you didn't update the module version. If the module version does not change, the pull server doesn't know to distribute a new version. The clients don't know to ask for a new version of that module. So in our module, we have a folder called DSC resources. And in there is where we put our resource modules. So in my Stack Exchange resources module, I have some resources for configuring certificates, firewall rules, network adapters, page file, all sorts of fun stuff. Let's take a look at the firewall. So in my firewall rule resource, I have my get, set, and test target resource functions. And each of those takes the same parameter sets. And there's a lot of parameters in this one. But what it does is it goes and grabs the firewall, and this basically just wraps a couple of the net firewall rule commandlets. And so I have a test, and it will go through and take a look and say, oh, hey, is this firewall rule, does it have local port or remote port configured? Is it allow or deny? Is it allow a particular application? Whatever the particular firewall rule is. And it'll go through and it'll test it and make sure that the configuration manages. And there's a bunch of tests there as far as what it's doing. And then it returns whether or not the configuration matches. So there's not all that much magic happening there. The set target resource then goes through and does what I need to do. A couple of things a couple of little gotchas I want to call out here. If you are using PS bound parameters when you're passing things around, DSC, when it runs, it will call these commands with verbose and debug passed to them so that it can get those streams. So if your command if any command you're calling and you're passing PS bound parameters to it, if you're not expecting debug to be there, because debug can sometimes drop you into prompting to continue, that will be a problem because this stuff is running unattended. You can't actually go in and say, yes, continue. So there's no confirm option. So you might either need to remove debug if you're going to pass PS bound parameters, or make sure you pass confirm : false for commands that are going to require some confirmation. And it just goes through and runs either, if an existing firewall rule is in place and I just need to modify it, I can set it. If I need to create a new one, fine. Or in the case I don't want that rule to be there, we have a remove net firewall rule. There is a common pattern that's kind of promulgated by the default resources, and that is having this ensure parameter, which, yep, here we go. This is not a magic parameter. This is something you have to implement in your resources if you want to follow that pattern. So if you look at a lot of the inbox resources and some of the custom resources that have been distributed, you'll see that they have this ensure option. And usually it's defaulted to present, so you don't have to include that unless you're going to, say, ensure absent. But that's something you need to handle and to work with. So we have these functions, and desired state configuration knows how to load a module and to call these particular functions. But we need one more thing really to map the parameters coming out of our configuration to our resources. And that's the schema.mof file. There's a couple of components I want to point out in the schema.mof. Hopefully you will never have to manually write one of these. They're not that hard, but there's not a lot of value in having to manually write them. Fortunately, there are some tools to help with this. In my DSC, I think it's my DSC development module, which is out on the GitHub repo. There's a new mof file command. So you can point it at an existing PSM1 and it will generate the schema.mof based on that. And then there's the DSC resource designer from the PowerShell team, and that can actually that has commands to generate these schema.mofs as well. So you have some options to not have to manually write these things. But there are a couple things that you'll want to know about this. First off, friendly name. This is where we go from the mapping of the resource name, the resource module. For example, in my case, I have Stack Exchange Firewall Rule. I don't want to have to write Stack Exchange Firewall Rule in all my configuration documents. So I can give it a friendly name, a firewall rule. And so when I write my configuration, I can say configuration node firewall rule, and then give it a name and go from there. This document is the one place where we configure that. The other thing we want to keep in mind is our key values. Our key values cannot be arrays. These are the parameters that we mark as mandatory. If we mark a parameter as mandatory in our configuration documents, most of the tools that generate these things will try to make them key properties. If you have an array as a mandatory parameter, chances are that you might have to come back and edit your schema.mof to get rid of that key and make it a right attribute, because this will fail to validate. So we've got a couple of those little gotchas there. Fortunately though, we do have some tooling to help us with that. In the DSC resource designer that the PowerShell team put out, there's a command, test-DSC resource. It's hugely valuable. So just a little bit about my environment. We'll go more into this later this afternoon, but when I make a modification to a resource and I check that into my source control system, I have a build server watching, and it will pull those configs and it runs it through some tests. It runs all the unit tests, but then it also runs this test-DSC resource command. And what test-DSC resource does is it goes and takes a look at the schema.mof document, and it makes sure that those parameters match up to what you've declared, or that these match up to the parameters you've declared for your set, test, and get functions, and that those three all have the same commands. So there is some tooling there to help make sure that the resources that we're generating are valid resources. Let's see here. With the DSC resource designer and test DSC resource, we get to see stuff like so this is going to run for a little minute here, run my unit tests, and then we get down to, after we run some of these, go back, it starts calling and loading these things, and it will actually go, and I'll show you some of the log messages here. Lots of verbose messages. But it will go through and actually checks the schema.mof, it checks your parameters, make sure that this is going to be a valid DSC resource to load. And it does this in a temp namespace. So it gives temporary names to these resources so that they're not actually they're not really cluttering up directly your system. Now, one caveat: the test DSC resource doesn't clean up after itself so well. It does leave these temp WMI classes registered, and there are some commands in place in the tooling on GitHub to actually go and remove those. But for the most part, that doesn't hamper you too much. So you see things like, schema file found, test the mof file, verify the syntax. Not so easy to see that there. Testing the schema file's compliance to the contracts. Test the PSM1 file. Verifies that the module, that all the required module functions are there. So as you're developing your resource, learn to use and love that test DSC resource command. That will definitely help you catch errors before you actually start deploying those resources. Now, how do we make our DSC resources discoverable on a system? So when you have a new DSC resource, it needs to be somewhere on your the module that contains it needs to be somewhere on PS module path. And in the case of when this resource runs to apply in a configuration, it needs to be in the PS module path that's visible to the system context. So not the user specific. So if it's in your profile script to add the location where your DSC resources live, that's not going to help you when it comes time to apply this resource. Fortunately, with PowerShell v4, we have a new location for PS module path that is available to the computer context. And that's in env program files, Windows PowerShell /modules. And this is where the pull server will deposit modules that it downloads. And so that is the place that we should be putting our custom resources when we need to have them apply to a system. When you're just testing them and developing them, they don't necessarily have to be in that particular spot, but for them to apply, they need to be there. Now, the other place they could go, and I don't recommend this, is in PS Home modules. That will be found as well, but that is not a location that we should just be deploying stuff to. Early on in desired state configuration, that's where we put a lot of stuff because we didn't know how to load them otherwise. But now you want to stay away from there and use the program files directory and store your resources there. You can create other locations that these things can be loaded from by adding to the PS module path for the computer context. But now you have another thing to troubleshoot if things aren't going quite how you expect. So we try to stay in program files there with these resources. Okay, so we've got our resources. We have our module metadata. One thing it's not required, but I recommend having a PSD1 file with your DSC resource, and that command exports the get target resource, set target resource, and test target resource functions. And that's because when we go to generate our configurations and we use the import DSC resource command, which we'll look at when we delve into configurations, it looks for the resource to export these commands and can actually throw an error if it doesn't see those commands exported. So if you're not using export module member in your PSM1 file, or you're not explicitly stating that we have these functions to export in our PSD1 file, you might have a difficulty loading your custom resource to generate your schemas or to generate your configuration documents. So I always include that. The tooling that I was talking about for doing that is in my DSC development module. And I have a new DSC resource from module. And you'd give it a path to a module folder or to a PSM1 file. And it will generate the schema.mof for you, where the only thing you need to do is go edit the friendly name to be what you want. And it will also generate a PSD1 file for you with some of your basic information already filled out for you. So there's no reason to go the hard way around creating those documents. You can just, in order to get started writing a DSC resource, you need to be able to write a PSM1 file and write 3 functions. There's not a huge hurdle to getting started with this. As long as you keep in mind error handling and that this is not an interactive user context, so anything that's going to prompt for confirmation needs to be squelched, and that the debugging story. Now, this is supposed to be getting better with WMF5. I haven't had a chance to test this out too much. There's a blog post in the PowerShell team blog actually about debugging, about the debugging story, how it's improving. But write verbose is your friend here, because that's what's going to make it out to the event log. That's what we're going to see in our start DSC configuration, or when we remotely invoke a poll from a node and we can get the verbose messaging back. This is where we can watch and see what actually is what's happening and what the path is that our resources are taking. So If you write a module, you add error handling, you add a lot of verbose logging, handle confirmation prompts, you're going to be just fine. And I would love to start seeing some more contributions to the PowerShell.org repo. Even if you think that the resource you are creating is so insignificant it wouldn't matter to anybody else, I will show you one of the most insignificant DSC resources that I have that I use every time I deploy a system because it's part of our base server configuration. It's a really complicated resource. And it sets the time zone. This is the sum total of the set method. There's not a lot to get, there's not a ton of work to get a resource to do some of this basic stuff. And you can do anything that you can do in PowerShell as long as you remember you're in the system context. So you don't have your user context, you're operating as the machine account. So if you need credentials, you need to pass those in. If you need access to remote network stuff, you need to consider that you're in the computer context. As long as you've got that under control, resources are not any different than writing a PowerShell module. There's some other metadata and stuff around there, but there is stuff to help you get that in place. So with that, are there any questions? Yes?
When you look at some of the like kind of shift resources, like you mentioned features, and files, like do you think it'd be a nice add if they kind of like an ensure only? You know, like so you describe features, you just want to see the AD module.
Yep.
Do you think it's useful to just describe the feature set that you do want and just ensure that no other features pop up?
Possibly. Though, so you can be, specifically for features, it's really easy to code gen what that document looks like and to generate what you don't want to be there. And it's easy enough in a configuration. Actually, you can hide that kind of in a nested configuration, so it's not. And so when we look at nested configs, you'll see I can show you what I do with web servers because there's a ton of roles I want installed. But I don't want that kind of cluttering up my one big view. That might be a nice addition. To say I only want these particular ones to be installed. Now you might have to The problem is each resource doesn't necessarily know about other resources, so you'd have to somehow compile the list. Possibly. Or you're part of your document or part of your configuration generation, you might say, okay, this is the list of resources that I want to have. Go install all these, and then only install. And then I have another list that says, here's all the resources or all the features that should be installed. If anything else is installed, uninstall it. You could definitely do something like that, and you could do it with what we have now. One of the caveats is the installation of the Windows features is very sensitive to dependencies. So if in order for me to install one of the IIS features, and here I can actually show that right now. In order for me to install one of the IIS features, excuse me, web server. So, for example, in order for me to install the HTTP common role, for example, I need to make sure that my web server role is installed beforehand. If I don't have some of this dependency information, sometimes the feature installations will hang up and say, hey, I'm missing dependencies, I can't install. And then things kind of grind to a halt. So we have this depends on capability. And this is, and thank you for bringing this up actually. So the depends on is this magical feature that is, or this magical parameter that's added to all of our resources. You don't have to write anything to support this. And this helps the local configuration manager determine what order to run stuff in. And so you can say, you know, I don't want you to attempt to install web common HTTP until you see that web servers installed. But in the case of Windows features, some of the stuff is very sensitive to the dependency order. So when you generate, you know, and say I have this list of features I want to install, the part that generates all of those installers. So, you know, the reason I don't have a big array and a for each creating all of these is because I wanted to make sure I got these dependencies in place. So you're usually being a little more intentional about what Windows features you declare out. And so for me to go and then say, okay, I also want to create a resource that checks to make sure none of those are, nothing else other than those specific things is there. That would be, I'd be duplicating some effort, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not something I just approached yet. Yes?
Just more of a comment. So Stephen gave a great example of how you can do this on your own with what's shipped today. But as Jeffrey mentioned a bit this morning, that we are incrementally adding features, and the idea of knowing the entire set of what should be true is absolutely something we've heard. A great example is when you're doing firewall rules. You're like, I want to have these three open and nothing else. You don't necessarily want to write a ensure equals absent for everything else. Although right now you can do it with code generation. So that's a good point. If you haven't already, one of the ways that really helps us to understand where we're missing features, if you go onto the PowerShell Connect site, and that's where you can do feature requests, and that really helps us figure out which ones are important to the community as well.
And guys, just to tack on to what Lee's saying here, from an outside perspective, these guys are moving fast on this stuff. I mean, they're kicking out waves of resources to kind of give us kind of a jump start and things. But the beta for DSC was available about a year ago. The beta for the next version is out now, and they're moving quickly on this stuff. So start even if you're not going to use it in production, start kicking the tires and give them the feedback now so they can work on it. And when you are ready to look at it in a production capacity, the feature set that you need is there. Yes?
So this all runs under the system context. Mm-hmm. So, and if you view credentials, like if you want to specify this service to run under these, service account credentials, where's the best place for those credentials to live?
Are you coming to my later session?
If that's where the answer is.
Yes. So the session after lunch, one of the things we're going to talk about is getting secrets and credentials in a secure manner from your workstation where you're generating where you're starting to create your configs to the clients, and because you might have multiple hops along the way. DSC has some inbox stuff to secure creds from your pull server from the generated configs to the clients. But if you have a source control or some kind of intermediate repository in between there's a step there that we need to protect those credentials and things for. And I've got some workflow around fixing that. So, all right. If there are any other questions, I will be around for the next 15 minutes because then I'm back up here. And we'll be talking about configurations. Otherwise, go grab some coffee, stretch your legs, hit the restrooms, whatever, and we'll see you back here in a few minutes.
Stephen, you probably haven't noticed it,